All right, Shabbos, good morning. Let us begin. So first I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Sivan, Justin and Abigail Rosemore for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in memory of their beloved son Kobe, Chaim Yaakov David, Ben Zichron Levracha Ben Yosef Tzadok, and also to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Sivan, Alan, and Sue Meyerowitz and family, Jason, Deborah, Justin, Rebecca, Mindy, and Simcha, and all the grandchildren for dedicating the Shurim and Drushos this month. In the Zechos of Rafu Shema for Sue Shulamis Tova Bas Mindel. And Abose, with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Kuf 100, and we are picking up in Mirza Hashem on Tzadik Tesam Beis 99b, 2 lines up from the bottom. Omar Rava. So Abose, so really some fascinating Gemaras, excuse me, a little bit of a continuation on yesterday's motif of what happens in different types of situations regarding various concepts or variations of different rishuyos. We'll see what I mean in just a moment. Amar Rava. So Rava said as follows. Pshitali, it's obvious to me that mayim al gabi mayim haim hanachasam. Listen to this interesting phrase. Water on top of water is the proper placement of water. Or water is at rest when it's on top of water. What does that mean? So let's say for argument's sake, you go ahead and you draw water, and you take that water from one rishus to another rishus, one domain to another. So now the halacha is you're only chayiv for otzah, you're only chayiv for transferring an object. If you take the item, uproot it, do an akira in one domain, and the hanocha in a putting down in a second domain. So we'll say, so the shaila is, for example, how do you view something like water? So for example, water, right? When you skim water off the top, do you assume that that water is at rest or not? So Rava says that mayim al gabi mayim, when water is on top of water, hainu hanachasan, the water is considered to be at rest. Rashi says hainu hanachasan ve'im natal miktsasan v'hotzi havi akira. So let's say the water in a sea or the water in a river, the water wherever it might be, is considered to be at rest. And therefore, when you go ahead and you take it, that is the equivalent of uprooting it from its place of rest and transferring it to a different domain. What about egos agabi mayim? We'll say conversely, let's say a nut. Let's say, I guess the easiest way I like to illustrate is maybe like a walnut. You have a walnut that's floating on water. So the Gemara says, egos agabi mayim, top of kuf, 100a, lav hainu hanachasan. That is not considered to be at rest. So it's very interesting. So if you were to have a walnut floating on water, and you were to take that walnut from the top of the water and let's say transfer it into a different domain, the Gemara is suggesting, Rava is suggesting, that halacha l'maisa, that's not hotzah. That's not hotzah. Why is that not hotzah? Because halacha l'maisa, the walnut is not considered to be at rest. Because again, since it's floating on top of the water, it's not at rest, therefore there's no akira. So this is really quite interesting. So whereas if you take a cup of water, you scoop up water, let's say from a pond or somewhere else, and you take that cup of water into a different rishos, that's hotzah. Because water on top of water is considered to be at rest. But an object floating on water is not considered to be at rest. Therefore, when you take the nut, for example, floating on top of the water, that's not called a bona fide akira. So by Rava, let's listen to the shaila. Egos b'kli v'kli tzava gabi mayim. Okay, so let's make it a little bit more complicated. So let's say now you have a walnut in a utensil, and the utensil is floating on the water. So let's say now what's the shaila? Mi amrinan basar egos azlinon. Do we say we go after the nut? And I will say lemaisa what? The nut is at rest. Right? Why is it not at rest? Because it's sitting inside of the kli. So remember again, the utensil, right? So as vis-a-vis the egos is at rest. So do we go after the nut? And the nut is at rest. Therefore, this is a bona fide akira. V'hanayich o dilma basar kli azlinon v'halonayich. Or conversely, do we go after the utensil? And the utensil itself is not at rest because the utensil is floating on top of the water. To which the Gemara says, teku. Take after you feel enough. So therefore, again, if you run into the situation of a floating walnut on Shabbos, conventional wisdom is leave it alone. Right? So again, when Navi comes to tell us what to do with it, but Lamaisa, right now, better not to move it. Says the Gemara, Shemen al gabi yain. Listen to this interesting case. What about oil on top of wine? So obviously, oil will float to the top of wine. So we'll say, how do we view that? Shemen al gabi yain. So just understand what the shaila is. Look at Rashi. Shemen al gabi yain, actually, le'inyan Shabbos. So remember, what we're asking is as follows. if let's say you have oil resting on top of wine, and now you go ahead and you take that oil, you take a cup of oil, and you move it to a different reshus. So we'll say, is that called an act of hotzah or not? So the Gemara says as follows. This is actually quite interesting. Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. The truth is, this machlokes, this question is a machlokes Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. Rabbi says we're going to see Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. Their machlokes has nothing to do with Shabbos. Their machlokes is actually vis-a-vis Tumah. But we're taking that machlokes as it applies by Shabbos, as it applies by Tumah, and we're applying it to Shabbos. Watch this. Disnan, because we learned. Shemen shaltzaf al gabi yayin. Same case. I have oil floating on top of wine. Vinaga tvul yom b'shemen, and a tvul will say, who's a tvul yom? So remember again. So just so you understand, this is oil and wine of truma. Rashi says over here, shetzaf al gabi yayin. Rashi says, this on shemen shal truma, shal tzaf al gabi yayin shal truma, mishum hachi naket tvul yom, mishum sheposal ve'eno metame. Hilchach la pas. So listen to this. So we'll say, I have wine and oil of truma. Now, what happens is I mix them together. So by definition, the oil floats on top of the wine. A tvul yom. Who's a tvul yom? Tvul yom is a person who was tameh. But he went to the mikvah. He went to the mikvah already. What is he waiting for? He's waiting for Harav Shemesh. He's waiting for the sun to go down. Now the halacha is that if a Tavul Yom touches Truma, he pasels the Truma. He invalidates the Truma. So as I see here, the shayla that's coming up over here. You have a Tavul Yom who touches Truma oil that is situated on top of Truma wine. So you know what the shayla is going to be? The shayla is, does he just impart Tuma to the shemen, to the oil which is on top, or does he impart tuma, or really not tuma? Does he passel the entire mixture? Which I will say. So, what's the fundamental shaila over here? The fundamental shaila is: do we view truma oil sitting on top of truma wine as one entity, and therefore, when he passels the oil, he passels the wine, or do we view it as two different entities? As the oil sitting on top of the wine, the oil is one thing. The wine is something separate, and halacha l'maisa, passeling one does not automatically passel the other. That's the shayla. So here we go. So shemen shetzaf agabe yayin v'nagal tvul yom b'shemen lo passel ela shemen. So the Rabbanan say that if a tvul yom touches truma shemen that is situated on top of truma wine, he only passels the shemen. He does not passel the wine. They're considered to be like two different entities. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, no, Shnehem Chibor Ze Lo Ze. Ultimately, again, they are connected one to the other. They're considered to be one entity. Now, both said the Gemara wants to suggest that the same, and therefore, again, as soon as the Tvul Yom touches the Shemen, he automatically passels the Shemen and the Yayin. So the Gemara wants to suggest that this machlokes by Tumah is the same machlokes by Shabbos. Look at Rashi. Shnehem Chibor, Dahavi Kechad V'nifsal Afa Yayin. Ule'inyan Shabbos nami l'Rabbanan havi le'ke'egos al gabi mayim ule'Rabbi Yochanan havi ke'mayim al gabi mayim. So both say, so therefore again, according to the Rabbanan will say that oil on top of wine is like the nut floating on the water. And just like everyone agrees that if you pick up the nut floating on the water, the nut is not considered to be at rest, so too again the oil floating on top of the wine is also not considered to be at rest. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds, however, again, it's one entity, and therefore, again, it's all considered, it's Mayim al Gabi Mayim, and everybody agrees that Mayim al Gabi Mayim ultimately is going to go ahead and be considered like one entity. If you were to scoop it up, therefore, you would be chayiv. So the Gemara is just suggesting that the machlokes by Truma is the same machlokes by Shabbos. Good. So says the Gemara, Amar Abaye. So Abaye says as follows. Bar B'Rishus Rabbim, this is actually a really interesting case. Bar B'Rishus Rabbim, Amuka Asara Urachav Shmona. Supposed to remember again, as we've already established, the dimensions for a Rishus HaYachid are 10 tfachim deep, 4 tfachim wide. Or I should say a makom of arba, 4 by 4. So you need an area, right? You need an area 4 tfachim with 4 tfachim of depth. That creates a Rishus Hara. That creates a Rishus HaYachid. So Rabbi said, just listen to the dynamic of this, which means that fascinatingly enough, Now, I will say the reason why this is intriguing is as follows. Whenever we think about a Rishus Hayachid, we assume that means what? An area that belongs to a person. Like my house is my Rishus Hayachid. In Halacha, you could have a Rishus Hayachid that is a halachic Rishus Hayachid, even though what? There's no person who owns that area. This is really quite fascinating. So this is why, for example, let's say in a Rishus Harabim, right, in a public domain, if you happen to have a pit or a hole that is 10 tfachim deep and 4 tfachim wide, that is a Rishus Hayachid. That is a private domain. No one owns it. That's correct. Because also it's really quite interesting. In Halacha, the definition of a Rishus Hayachid is an area that satisfies certain dimensions. It's not really dependent on actual ownership, just like a Rishus Harabim. We'll see in case of Rishus Harabim. So therefore, most that's the case. Bar, excuse me. Bar Rishus Harabim Amuka Asara Urechav V'Shmona. Suppose here you go. In the middle of the Rishus Harabim, you have a situation of a pit that is 10 tfachim deep and 8 tfachim wide. And I will say now again, so this is definitely a bona fide Rishus Hayachid. It actually has more than enough dimensions. Now watch this. What did you do? V'zark l'socha machatzelas. You throw a mat into it. Just throw a mat into it. So what's the halacha? Chayiv. Okay, so we'll say, so that's not a chiddush, right? So again, case number one is I'm standing in the Rishus Harabim. I throw a mat into the pit. I'm chayiv. Why am I chayiv? Because I've transferred an item from Rishus Harabim into Rishus Hayachid. Good. That's it. Nothing more to talk about. Watch this case. Chilkam machatzalas. So let's say what you do is you throw the mat in, but you throw it in a way where it divides the pit. So it becomes like a dividing wall in the pit. So remember, the dimensions here are very important. This is 10 tfachim deep, 8 tfachim wide. You throw in a mat, and the mat, let's say, goes right down the middle of the pit. So we'll say, now watch this. What's talach over here? Pater. Now, both say, this is fascinating. Now, why are you pater over here? Why are you pater? Look at Rashi. Zark l'socha machatzelas, mishum seifa nakit. The boy, so skip down a little bit in that Rashi. He says, Danach is siluk mechitza, b'hadi adadi pater, v'hacha, siluk mechitza, dizil hacha lakarba, v'zil hacha lakarba. Now, both say, watch this. When you throw in the mat, and the mat goes right down the middle of the pit, the Gemara wants to suggest that you're pater. Why? Because they're both say, what happens when you go ahead and you split that pit? Now you have two different pits, and neither pit has the requisite dimensions for a Rishus Hayachid. Why not? This is fascinating. Remember again, what were our dimensions? 10 tfachim deep, 8 tfachim wide. Now, b'pashtos, when you put a mat right down the middle, what have you done? Remember, the mat has what? Some level of thickness as well. So because of that, when that mat divides the pit, neither pit now has the requisite dimensions for a Rishus Hayachid. Shabbos says, so fascinatingly enough, if you just take the mat and throw it in and it lands on the bottom of the pit, you're going to be chayiv. But if you throw in the mat or put in the mat in a way in which it subdivides the pit, exactly in the middle, in fact, you're not going to be chayiv. Why won't you be chayiv? Because lemaisa, that mat takes away from the dimensions of the two Rishus Hayachid, and it kind of negates either air from being a Rishus Hayachid. Therefore, you really have not performed an act of Hotzah. To which the Gemara says, La abaye de pshita le de machatzalas mevatla mechitza, kol shekin chulya de mevatla mechitza. So both say, remember again, according to Abaye, where he says that the case of the mat negates the mechitzas of the pit, certainly he will agree in the case of the chulya. Both remember again, we had a very similar case. The chulya case was where you had a pit that was 10 tfachim deep by 4 tfachim wide. What did you do? You threw in a clump of dirt, right? And what that clump of dirt did is filled in the last tefach of the bottom of the pit, thereby making the pit only 9 tfachim deep. So remember again, we had a shaila there. What do you do in that case? Do we say that ultimately, again, now since you have a pit that doesn't conform to the requisite dimensions, you didn't really do active hotzah or not? Or do we view no as if you did active hotzah and then subsequently the dimensions became negated? So we're just saying, according to Abaye, who says that it's pashut in the case of the mat, that the mat is mevatel, the dimensions of the Rosh Hashanah, kol shekein chuya. He certainly will agree that halach l'mais in the case of the mound of dirt, you won't be chayiv as well. The mevatel mechitza. The Rabbi Yochanan the miboy lechuya machatzelas pshita the lo mevatel mechitza. But according to even Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that there's a shayla by chuya, will agree that ultimately, again, or I should say, Rabbi Yochanan, who is not sure about the case of chuya, he will hold that by machatzelas, by the mat, it certainly is not mevatel the mechita. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rabbi Yochanan machatzelas pshita delay the lo mevatla de'inam ya'aminan siluk mechitza va'anachas chayfetz ki adadi pater hacha chayiv de lo mevatele hilchach lav siluk mechitzi. So both saying, even Rabbi Yochanan, who's not sure about the case of the mound, right? Because you see, the case of the mound is a little bit stronger than this case. Why? Because in the case of the mound, Rabbi say you've mamish filled in the pit. In the case of the machatzelas, remember again, this is an external partition that's been introduced into this pit. So Rabbi Yochanan, who's not sure about the case of the dirt, will certainly hold that in this case, the introduction of the mat does not negate the dimensions of the pit. Okay, to which the Gemara says as follows: V'amra Abaye, bar b'shus harabim. Another case about say, bar b'shus harabim, amuka asara urechava arba. Listen to this case. You have a bar b'shus harabim that is 10 tefachim deep, 4 tefachim wide. Okay, so again, requisite dimensions for a rishus hayachid. Now watch this. Malaya mayim, if it's filled with water, v'zarak l'socha, you throw something into it, chayiv, you'll be chayiv. Conversely, so we'll say, so now in this case, my pit, which is my rishus hayachid, is filled with water. So the Gemara says, even though it's filled with water, halacha l'maaseh, if you throw something into it, you are still going to be chayiv. Still going to be chayiv. The Gemara says, conversely, malaya peros, what happens if the pit is filled with peros? So the Gemara, excuse me. So the Gemara says, v'zarach l'socha, and you throw an item into the pit. What's going to be the halacha? Pater. You'll be pater. My time, and I will say, why the distinction? My time, mayim lo mevatli mechitzta, peros mevatli mechitzta. Very simple distinction. Water does not negate the partitions or the walls. Fruit does, which I will say is a very simple idea. If you throw an object into a pit filled with water, what's going to happen? That object still has the ability to sink to the bottom of the pit. So therefore, again, the presence of water in no way negates the dimension of the pit. Masha inkain, if the pit is filled with fruit, so by definition, you throw something into that pit, what happens to the object? It remains at the surface of the pit. There's an inability for it to sink down. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, the dimensions of the pit are in fact batal. Good. That supports this. Zorik min hayam le'istira, umina istira liyam. If one throws an object from the sea to the istira, Rashi says, husratya. Rashi says, min hayam le'istira, mikarmelis resarm. So we're going to see that the sea, the ocean, is a karmelis. Again, we're going to get into this actually in the next Mishnah is a karmelis. So if you throw an object from the sea to the sratya, so we'll say sratya is rishus harabim, right? Sratya literally means like the public thoroughfare. So if you throw an object from the sea to the public thoroughfare, what's the halacha? Pater. Rabbi Shimon says, Im yesh b'makom, im yesh, so we'll say, so focus on the second case. If you throw an object from the sea to the Rosh Hashanah, you're going to be pater, right? Because from Rosh Hashanah to a karmelis, you're not chayiv. Or similarly, if you throw something from the Rosh Hashanah into the sea, you'll also be pater. Because from Rosh Hashanah to a karmelis, you're pater. But watch this. Im yesh b'makom shezarak amok asara v'rachav arba. What happens if halacha l'maisa? When you throw it into the sea, into a place that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. Well, so let's say in the seabed itself, there's a pit. And the pit in the seabed is 10 tefachim deep, 4 tefachim wide, and the object lands in there, what does the Gemara say? Chayiv. So I'll say this goes back to the general idea, which is really quite fascinating, that although we typically assume that the definition of a Rishus HaYachid is a privately owned domain, right? Your home is your Rishus HaYachid, my home is my Rishus HaYachid. We begin to see that the halachic definition of a Rishus HaYachid is an area that conforms to certain dimensions and measurements. And once you have those dimensions and measurements, even if that area is situated in another Rishus, it takes on the identity of a Rishus HaYachid. Good, says the Mishnah. Let's go weiter. Hazorik arba amos bekosa. So we'll say, let's say again, here's the case. I'm standing in Rishus Harabim, and I throw an object. And the object travels Rishus Harabim and lands, we'll see, either in a wall or on a wall. So what's the halacha? Lemala me'asar tvachim kuzar ba'avir. If the object lands on the wall and it's above 10 tvachim, it's as if the object landed mid-air. Because remember again, the halacha is the airspace of Rishus Harabim only goes up to 10 tvachim. It doesn't extend above 10 tvachim. And therefore, again, if an object comes to rest above 10 tvachim in Rishus Harabim, I am not chayiv. Lemata me'asar tvachim kizrei baretz. But if the object comes to rest below 10 tvachim on the ground, and it's as if the object came to rest on the ground, hazorik ba'aretz arba amos chayiv. Similarly, again, if a person throws an object dalet amos on the ground, he's going to be chayiv. So we'll say, therefore, the Mishnah introduces us to the very important idea that Allah says, as much as we said that in Rishus Harabim, if you carry something dalet amos, or if you throw something dalet amos, you are chayiv. That's only if the object comes to rest within 10 tefachim. But if the object comes to rest above 10 tefachim, ultimately again you are pater. Why? Because the airspace of Rishus Harabim, public domain, only goes up until 10 tefachim. Remember, this is different than Rishus HaYachid, right? Rishus HaYachid, what's the halacha? You have airspace rights, right? Remember, essentially, Rishus Harabim has no real airspace. Above 10 tefachim is already makom p'tor, exempted area. Rishus HaYachid, your private domain, your airspace rights go all the way up. So says the Gemara, here we go, v'halonach, I don't understand. The Mishnah said that if you throw an object dalet amos and it comes to rest by a wall, ultimately, again, you're chayiv. But what do you mean it came to rest by a wall? Never came to rest. V'halonach. Both says what we always spoke about, the schmaltzy fig. I remember again the schmaltzy fig, which so I'll say the image therefore is you're throwing an object dalet amos, and literally it hits the wall and sticks to the wall. That's the chap over here. Listen to this case. Let's say let's take this case. You go ahead and you throw an object above 10 tefachim. Now both say. Now, this is the reverse case. Remember, now, in this case over here, what's happening is as follows. So, first of all, we've established case number one is the case of the Mishnah of Azorek Arba Amos Bekosel. Throwing an object 4 amos in the wall is a case of, let's say, an item that you're throwing dalet amos, and it comes to rest by sticking on the wall. That's the case. So, the Gemara now says over here, what about a different kind of case? We'll say, in this case, I'm standing in Rishus Harabim, okay? I throw an object, lemala me'asara. I throw the object and it lands above 10 tefachim. V'holcha b'nacha b'chor kolshehu, and it comes to rest in a small little crevice. Now, both say, now the chap over here is the crevice does not have the dimensions of a Rishus HaYachid. Remember again, what are the dimensions of Rishus HaYachid? 10 tefachim in height, 4 tefachim in space. So in this case, I've thrown an object. It's come to rest above 10 tefachim. But in a nook, right, in a little crevice that does not have the requisite measurements of a Rishus HaYachid. Now watch this. The Gemara says, "Banu lemachlokes re'meiv rabbanon." We've come to the machlokes re'meiv rabbanon. Both say, what's the machlokes? Here we go. Rabbi Meir damar chogekim lahashlim mechayev. According to Rabbi Meir, who says, I'll translate it and then we'll explain it. That you could hollow out an area in order to complete the requisite space. You would be chayev. The Rabbanon da'amri ein chokikin lahashlim lo machayev. According to the Rabbanon, who say that we do not hollow out a space in order to go ahead and complete the shir, you would not be chayiv. Now, what is this talking about? Amazingly enough, the machlokes shemen the Rabbanon is not by Shabbos; it's by mezuzah. Both say in order to be chayiv in mezuzah, you must have a doorway that is at least 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide. That's the minimum measurement of a doorway to be chayav in mezuzah. So the interesting shaila that comes up is as follows. Let's say you have the height, but because the doorway is an arch, you don't have the width. But I will say, but the doorway itself is embedded in like what's the right word for this is? Like a doorway is often embedded in a wall. So let's say you have an arched doorway. So the doorway, let's say the arch itself is less than 4 tfachim, but when you look at the wall does have the requisite width of 4 tfachim. I want to say it a little bit differently. If you were to square off the arch, you would have 4 tfachim. So we'll say, so the shaila is, that's called, do we say chokikin lahashlim? Do we say that we view the arch as if it's squared off, literally chiseled out, and therefore that the doorway does have the requisite shear, or not? So I'll say that is the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon. Rabbi Meir says that by hilchos mezuzah, we say chokikin lahashlim. Even if the archway itself does not have the requisite width, we view the entire wall as if it was hollowed out, and therefore halacha lamaisa we chayav in mezuzah. So Rabbi Meir, who says chokikin lahashlim, would also agree that what? Would also agree that by Shabbos, if you throw an object and it comes to rest in a crevice that is above 10 tfachim, and the crevice, there's enough room in the wall to hollow out an area of 4 tfachim, we view it as if it has come to rest in an area of 10 tfachim of height with 4 tfachim, and therefore you be chayiv. According to the Rabbanon who say by hilchos mezuzah, ein omen chokin lahashlim. We do not hollow out, chisel out space. Rather, space is defined by what it is. We don't start chiseling, we don't start hollowing, we don't start imagining. It is what it is. So to by Shabbos, he would say that you're pater as well. That supports this. Just so you should know, by hilchos mezuzah, we pass like the Rabbanan and not like Rabbi Meir. So, for example, if you have a doorway that is an arch and the arch is very narrow, only 4 tfachim. Let's remember again, it's a pretty narrow doorway. So even if the doorway is embedded in a larger wall, and quote unquote you can imagine being chiseled out, we do not imagine anything. In other words, it is what it is. If it is less than the opening of 4 tfachim, you're not chayav in mezuzah. So the Gemara says as follows. That supports this. Zorak lemala me'asara b'holcha v'nacha b'chor kol shu. If you're standing in Rosh Hashanah and you threw an object and it came to rest in a crevice that is more than 10 tfachim tall, but yet it does not have the requisite shear of 4 tfachim, Rabbi Meir mechayiv v'chachamim potrin. Rabbi Meir, who by mezuzah says chokikin lahashlim, will agree that by Shabbos will be chayiv. The chachamim who say ein omrin chokikin lahashlim will say that you're pater. Rabbi Yehuda Marav was another halacha, also quite interesting. Tel hamislakit asara mitoch arbo v'zorak v'nach al gabov chayiv. We'll say this is a very interesting case. What happens? You will say up until now, when we deal with the Rosh Hashanah, or we're dealing with as follows: is an area. I don't mean like your house. I mean like a place in Rosh Hashanah. So what's the definition of a Rosh Hayachid in Rosh Hashanah? An area that has 10 tfachim of height and 4 tfachim of space. So that could be whether it's like a pillar that extends upwards, or whether it's a hole or a pit in the ground that extends downwards. Now the Gemara introduces a new case, which is what happens if you have tel hamislakit, if you have a mound that has a gradual slope. So we'll say, let's say at the top of the slope it's 10 tfachim high. So what's the step? But yet again, at the top of the slope, there's not necessarily 4 tfachim of space. So it slopes up to a slope of 10 tfachim. So at the top it's 10 tfachim, but there's not 10 tfachim, but there's not 4 tfachim of space at the top of the slope. What's the halacha? So watch this. So tela mislakit asara mitoch arba. So we'll say if you have a slope that goes up 10 tfachim over a span of Dalit Amos. We'll say now we're switching to Amos. Over a span of Dalit Amos, the Zarak Vinach al Gabov Chayiv. If you throw an object and it comes to rest on top of that area, ultimately again you will be Chayiv. That supports this. So we'll say this is actually a very interesting halacha, right? So therefore, so look at Rashi. Tela mislakit shumadron v'holich u'mislakit ma'at ma'at ashmagil yud mitoch dalamis Harihu ki'ilu zokef kulo. V'havi Rishus Hayachid b'mokom govo. V'im zarak Rishus Rabbi v'nach al gabav chayiv. V'dafka nakit. Supposed to listen to this. So therefore, halacha l'maisa. What's interesting about this is as follows. Another dimension for Rishus Hayachid. So if you have a mound that has a gradual slope, and it's therefore, again, it gets the 10 tefachim of height over 4 tefachim of space, that area is considered to be a Rishus Hayachid. And if you were to throw something from Rishus Harabim and it were to land on that area, ultimately, again, you would be chayiv. Says the Martaina that supports this. Mavui sheshava l'socho v'nasem madron. Let's listen to this. We're getting now a little bit into Eruvin. Right, so I'll say in Eruvin we'll spend a lot more time regarding Mavui. But for our purposes today, remember again, the way that Talmudic homes were set up is you'd have multiple homes that would share a joint chutzner, share a joint courtyard. Those courtyards would all share a joint alleyway, mavui. That mavui would exit into the Rishus Harabim. So as we're going to see, the halacha is that you require a certain reminder or tikkun in your mavui to remind you not to carry out from your mavui into the Rishus Harabim. So it says the Gemara, watch this. Mavui sheshava l'socho. If you have a mavui, v'nasa madron Rishus Harabim, o shav l'Rishus Harabim v'nasa madron l'socho, o sem mavui eno tzarech lo lechi v'lo kora. So also listen to this. So if you have a mavui that has this same idea, if you have a mavui, ultimately again, the lashon of it is literally shav l'Rishus Harabim v'nasa madron. Or there's a slope in the mavui. Ultimately, again, a slope going out to Rishus Harabim or a slope coming into the mavui. What's the halacha? The halacha is such a mavui does not require any kind of tikkun. In other words, also the Gemara is just pointing out is that having an area that is sloped fundamentally changes the halachic identity of the area. So in the case of mavui, look at Rashi. V'nasem madron she'karka mavui gavoi mekarka Rishus Harabim. V'hutzrach l'shafeya itzal pischo l'tzad Rishus Harabim, o she'shal Rishus Harabim v'nasa madron l'socha, she'Rishus Harabim gavoa mikarka mavoi, knisa mavoi nami min ha'pesach v'lifnim gavoa kekarka Rishus Harabim, b'rachav amma. So all the point the Gemara is making over here is that if the mavoi has a slope, so ultimately again that slope is enough of a reminder that the area of the mavoi is separate and distinct from the rest of the Rishus Harabim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer, tel ha-mislakit asara mitoch arba, v'zarak v'nach al gabav chay. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says, similarly, if you have a tel, which is a mound, that ultimately, again, gains 10 tefachim of space over a slope of Dalet Amis, if you throw an object from a Rishus Harabim, and it lands on that mound, you will be chayiv. So we'll say, therefore, the Gemara giving us a brand new definition of Rishus Hayachid as well. So far we have 3 different types of Rishus Hayachid. Classic Rishus Hayachid, which is privately owned property. We'll call it Halachic Rishus Harabim, which is an area that is 10 tefachim of height by 4 tefachim of area. And now, a new shear, which is if you have a sloped mound that essentially achieves 10 tefachim of height, over a slope of Dalet Amis, halacha l'maisa, again, that's a Rishus Hayachid as well. Good. Says the Mishnah. Zarch l'soch Dalet Amis v'neskal gochos l'Dalet Amis pater. An interesting case. Let's say I'm standing in Rishus Harabim, and I throw an object, and it goes 3.5 amas. And then what happens? The object lands, and it rolls another half an amma. So what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, again, I'm going to be pater. Now, we'll say we're going to see it doesn't literally mean that the object landed. Rather, as Rashi points out, lo shenaf ali aretz tim kim lo tzricha lemeimar el sharuach galgalasu mina avidos. Listen to this. So we'll say, so the literal case is as follows: I throw an object, and let's say it's clear. After traveling 3.5 amas in Rishus Harabim, it's clear that the object is about to fall to the ground. But just as it's about to fall to the ground, what happens? A gust of wind takes it and picks it up and moves it outside of Dalet Amis. So in this case over here, my act of throwing was only going to move the object 3.5 amas, and the wind got a hold of it and propelled it the extra half amma for the 4 shear. So what's the halacha pater? In that case, I'm pater. Why? Because they both say the act that I did not transport the item of full dalet amis. It was really the wind that took it. Similarly, chutz the dalet amis v'niskagal l'soch dalet amis chayiv. They both say, now watch this. Let's say the converse case. I go and I throw an object. It travels 5 amis. But before it lands, what happens? The wind blows it back in. I'm going to be chayiv. So both say, in other words, halacha that the Mishnah is telling me is, we don't really look at the wind. We look at what your action had the koach to do. So if your action only had the koach to throw it 3.5 amas, and the wind picked it up and moved it the extra half amma out, you're pater because you didn't throw an object dalet amas. Conversely, if you threw it 5 amas, but before it got a chance to land, the wind blew it back in, halacha l'maisa, you will be chayiv because your action was one that moved the object 5 amas. So but 1 second, v'halonach, but the object never came to rest. If the object never came to rest, why would you be chayiv? Rabbi Yochanan, v'hu shenocha gabi mashu. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it must be that halacha l'maisa, the object came to rest a little bit. Now Rashi says something very interesting. Rashi says, shenocha gabi mashu, sha'amar k'tzas, v'achar kach niskalgel, v'hu adinim achzas haruach ba'avir, v'akvasol ma'at, so either Rashi means the object came to a rest on the ground, let's say for a moment, and then the wind picked it up again, or maybe the wind held it in place for a moment, but let's say within three tefachim of the ground, and then blew it back. That supports this. Zorak chutz dalet amis. If you threw an object and it went further than dalet amis, udachafto haruach, and then the wind blew it back, vichnisaso, and brought it back within dalet amis, afapi shechazrav asa pater. Even though the wind subsequently then took it back, you'd be pater. Achzasa haruach mashu. But if the wind allowed it to remain in place for just a moment, afapi shechazrav vichnisaso chayiv. Even if halacha l'maisa, again, the wind blew it back in, you would be chayiv. So we'll say, so bottom line, what the Gemara is saying is as follows. In all of these cases with the wind, so let's say this case where I throw the object and it goes 5 amas, and then the wind blows it back, let's say within dalet amas of me, I will be chayiv provided the item came to rest in some way. Coming to rest can be understood in one of 2 ways. Either the object actually falls to the ground and then the wind picks it back and blows it back to me, or Rashi says that halacha l'maisa, if it went ahead and even remained within 3 tefachim of the ground, the wind held it in place for just a moment and then blew it back in. So in order to be chayiv for any act of hotzah, the object has to come to rest in some way, which tells me as follows. If I threw an object and the object travels 5 amas, but the object never comes to rest and the wind just simply blows it back, I will not be chayiv for such an act of hotzah. Interesting. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Toch Gimel Rabbanon Tzarech Hanocha Gabi Mashud. Rava says that even according to the Rabbanon, even within Gimel, Rava says, remember again, the Rabbanon say, Rava said, this Rashi points out, going back to last week, remember again, we had a machlokas about Kluta Kimishun Chadamya. When an object travels through airspace, is it viewed as having coming to rest or not? So remember again, the Rabbanon Paskin, which today we Paskin, Kluta Lav Kimishun Chadamya. That ultimately when an object travels through airspace, we do not view the object as if it has come to rest, which tells you that according to the Rabbanon, even the Rabbanon who hold of Lavud, right? Lavud is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that an object within 3 tefachim of the ground is considered to be attached to the ground. That's only if what? If the object came to rest. If the object never came to rest, then even Lavud doesn't apply. So the Gemara says as follows. So again, within 3 tefachim of the ground, according to the Rabbanon, for Lavud Yini Hanacha, so Meimar is sitting and saying over this ruling. Amrali Ravina Meimar, so Ravina said to Meimar, Amr Beis Rabosai, Lav Hainu Mas Nisin, isn't that our Mishnah? Right, that's the Mishnah. Right, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, an object must come to rest in order to be considered transferred to a different domain. No, our Mishnah is different. The Rebbe said the case of the Mishnah is where an object is being taken by the wind. When it's being taken by the wind, miskalgal in sof al anuach. So when an object is being taken by the wind, it's not clear when and if and how it's going to land. maybe that's when you have to say the object has to come to rest in order to be considered transferred. However, again, the Gemara says, "Avahai kevan de sofa lanuach afa gavdolo nach kiman denachtami." I would have thought when an object is being thrown, where I know for sure it's going to come to rest. Therefore, again, maybe even if it doesn't come to rest within 3 tefachim, it's considered to be at rest. Kamash lana, according to the Rabbanon, halacha lemaisa, any object must come to rest in order to be considered part of that rishus. So we'll say, so what comes out of here is as follows. Whether it's a case ultimately again of throwing it and the wind gets a hold of it and blows it back, I'm only going to be chayiv if the object comes to rest for some amount of time in an area past Dalar Amis. Even by lavud, the Rabbanon who hold kluta shelo kimikunuchadami, that going through airspace is not considered to be as if an object came to rest, which is how we paskin. Even by lavud, when an item is within 3 tefachim of the ground and it's considered to be at rest, it's only at rest if what? If it actually comes to rest in some way. That's how we paskin halacha lemaisa. Good, says the Mishnah. But now, interesting sugya. Hazorik bayam. Let's say one throws an object 4 amas in the sea. Pater. Ultimately, again, one is pater. Now, why is that? The sea, interestingly enough, the ocean, the sea, is a carmelis. Rabbi say, you'll say, shouldn't that be Rishus Harabim? So remember, again, we're going to see this much more in Eruvin, but we'll see it here in Shabbos as well. The definition of Rishus Harabim is a certain amount of width, 16 amos in width, but you also require a certain amount of pedestrian traffic. Although the ocean, the sea, certainly has the width, it doesn't have the traffic. So because of that, again, it is not a bona fide Rishus Harabim, rather it is a carmelis. Remember again, a carmelis is an area that halacha lemaisa has certain Rishus Harabim qualities, but is not a bona fide Rishus Harabim. So hazarik bayam arba amos, if one goes ahead and throws an object in the sea, dalanam is pater. What is pater? V'haya rakak mayim or Rishus Mahalech. As well as in this case, let's say rakak mayim means you have a pool of water. So that's what you have a pool of water, but the Rishus Harabim passes through the pool of water. Hazorik lesocho dalet ames chayiv. If you throw dalet ames in the pool, you're going to be chayiv. We'll say why. The logic being because since the Rishus Harabim goes through the pool, therefore what the pool itself is considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim, and therefore if you throw dalet ames in the pool, you're going to be chayiv. The kamahu rakak mayim. We'll say the pool that we're talking about. How large is it? Pachos miasar tfachim. Obviously, it must be less than 10 tfachim. I will say, right, because obviously, once it's more than 10 tfachim, then again, the possibility is that it might be a Rishus Yachid, it might be a carmelis, depending on different scenarios. So therefore, again, the pool of water that is considered to be batal, so to speak, to the Rishus Harabim, is a pool that is less than 10 tfachim deep. But similarly, again, if you have a pool of water and the Rishus Harabim travels through it, hazorik b'socho dalet ames chayiv. If you go ahead and you throw an object 4 amas within that area, you will be chayiv. Now this seems to be fundamentally repetitive, right? It's saying the same thing twice. That essentially, if you have a pool of water in the Rishus Harabim, the Rishus Harabim goes through the pool of water, assuming the pool of water is halacha lemaisa part of the Rishus Harabim, and therefore, if you throw an object dalet amas in the pool, you will be chayiv. Now we're going to see why the Mishnah is repetitive. So it says the Gemara, so there was one of the rabbis said to Rabba, Bishlama hiluch trezimni. I understand why it has to speak about walking through the pool twice, right? Why it has to repeat about walking through the pool twice. Kamash malon hiluch al yedei adchak shmei hiluch. Tashmish ayidech dchak lo shmei tash. This is very interesting. Teach me a very important lesson. That an area in Rishus Harabim that could be traversed, that could be walked through, albeit with a bit of inconvenience or difficulty, is still considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. Masha'in kain, if you have an area that is not easily used by the public, that's not called Rishus Harabim. So we'll say we're going to see this example of Tashis. So we'll say Rashi points out there, for example, let's say you have a pit in the Rishus Harabim that is only 9 tfachim deep. So remember again, 9 tfachim deep means it's not a Rishus Hayachid. But at 9 tfachim, it's also an area that is not easily used by the public. So what we're going to see is an area which is not easily used by the public, is not called Rishus Harabim. So very interesting distinction. An area that is not easily traversed by the Rabbim, but is traversable, is still called Rishus Harabim. An area not easily used by the Rabbim, however, is not called Rishus Harabim. However, the Gemara says, "Ela rakak trei zimni lamali." But why do you have to teach me the case of the pool twice? Watch this. Both said to teach me that the pool, as long as it's not 10 tefachim deep, is considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim, both during the summer and during the winter. Watch this. I need both. Because if we had just said the case of the pool once, I would say, when is the pool considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim? When is that, Rabosai? During the summer. During the summer. Why during the summer? Right, why during the summer? So the Gemara says, Davidi inshi demaskila kurinafshayu. Because during the summer, people walk through the pool. Why do they walk through the pool? Because they like to cool off. They like to cool off, right? Again, so a person's walking, they get hot, the pool is there, fantastic. But ultimately, again, I would have thought that maybe the pool during the rainy season is not part of the Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because people don't walk through the pool in the rainy season, which is the winter. Rather, they walk around it. So because they walk around it, maybe it's only during the summertime that the pool is considered to be part of the Rosh Hashanah, not during the winter. And if the Mishnah would have only taught me ultimately that the pool is part of the Shram during the winter, why? Because we'll say, remember again, you're dealing with dirt roads, dirt Rosh Hashanah. So since already a person is dirty by walking on the road, because the roads are all muddy, a person doesn't care about walking through a pool of water. But during the summertime, where the roads are not muddy, a person is going to be careful and not want to walk through the pool. Therefore, I will say the Mishnah teaches me the case of the pool twice. To teach you that what? Both during the winter and during the summer, as long as the pool is not 10 tefachim deep, the pool is part of the Rishus Harabim. So Abai Omer, it's Abai said it's necessary for a different reason. I would have thought as follows. Excuse me. I would have thought as follows. It's Sadat Chamino, Hani Mili, Heichadolo Havik Dalaramis. So I might have thought, when is the pool part of Rishus Harabim? When the pool doesn't have an area of Dalar Amis. Aval Heicha David Dalar Amis Akufi Makfile. But I might have thought that maybe when the pool is more than Dalar Amis, people walk around it. Kamashmon, the Gemara says no. Kamashmon and Rabbi say that really when it comes to the pool, it's a function of depth. If it doesn't have 10 tefachim of depth, then it's considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. If it has more than 10 tefachim of depth, then ultimately again, it's part of the Rishus Harabim. Rav Ashi Amar Itzrich Saladai Chamino Hanimi Lihecha Dahavadalid Aval Hecha Delo Havi Arba Mifsi Pasile. So we'll say, listen to this. So Rav Ashi says, I might have thought, when is it that the pool is part of Rishus Harabim? Only when it's 4 tefachim in area. But if it's less than 4 tefachim, a person skips over it. So because a person skips over it, maybe it's not considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. To which the Gemara says, Va'azdar of Ashi Tame. And therefore, again, say the Mishnah quotes the case of the pool twice to tell you that no, even if it's not 4 tefachim in area, and even so, remember again, if the pool is so small that it's not 4 tefachim in area, you would say people never really walk over that, or I should say walk through it, they skip over it. So because they skip over it, maybe it's not considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. Kamash Malon, the Mishnah teaches me no, that even if it's less than 4 tefachim in area, it's still considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. Why? Watch this. The Gemara says, "Va'az Rav Ashi letamei." Rav Ashi goes according to his reasoning. Dam Rav Ashi, Hayman dizarak v'nach aguda de gamla mechayev. So let's listen to this case. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, "Aguda de gamla al daf shebegesher hamuta l'rochav hagesher kishar dapim umuvdal mechavero." So let's say you have a plank of a bridge. And the plank of the bridge ultimately, again, is kind of like, it's a little bit wobbly. So it's a bit, it's not as solid as the other planks. So under normal circumstances, a person, when they were walking over the bridge, would sooner go ahead and just kind of like skip over that plank. I don't really want to walk on that plank. They would sooner just skip over that plank. The halacha is that what? If you go ahead and you throw an object and it lands on that plank, you're chayiv. Why Rabbi say? Because halacha l'maisa, even though people normally skip over it, people do walk over it as well, and therefore it's considered to be a bona fide part of the rishus. So too by the pool, even though at less than 4 tfachim, a person would more normally skip over it than walk through it. Nevertheless, halacha l'maisa, it is considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. So therefore, Rabbi say, a number of novelties come out from this case. So the pool, Rabbi say, bottom line is, the pool that is in the Rishus Harabim, as long as it does not have 10 tfachim of depth, is considered, more than 10 tfachim of depth, is considered to be part of the Rishus Harabim. Once it's more than 10 tfachim of depth, Rabbi say, at that point in time, people will not really walk through it, they would walk around it. Good, and this is true in the summer, this is true in the winter, this is true Dalet Amis, not Dalet Amis, Dalet Tfachim, not Dalet Tfachim, Halacha l'maisa, everything is dependent on depth. Less than 10 Tfachim, the pool is part of the Rosh Hashanah. More than 10 Tfachim, the pool is not part of the Rosh Hashanah. Weiter, Mishnah. Hazorik min hayam liyabasha, min hayabasha liyam. Let's listen to this case. Person goes ahead and throws an object from the shore to the sea. Now remember again, I will say, this is a case of we assume the shore is Rishus Harabim. The sea, as you saw before, is a Carmelis. So I'm throwing from the Carmelis to Rishus Harabim, or from Rishus Harabim to a Carmelis, uminayam lesfino, or from the sea to a boat. I will say the sea is a Carmelis. The boat we assume is what? Rishus Hayachid, a private domain. Uminasfino liyam, or from the boat to the sea. Uminasfino lechaverta, or from one boat to another boat. Again, we'll see what that case is. In all of those cases, Potter, which makes sense, because again, remember, in all those cases, either throwing from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah, from a Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelis, or from a Carmelis to a Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, in all of those cases, you will be Potter. Sfinos kshuros zubazu. What happens if you have boats tied to each other? Metaltlin mizulazu. You are permitted to go ahead and carry from one to the other. Im einon kshuros. But if they are not tied together, Afapi shemukafos, even though they are next to each other, ein metaltalin mizu lezu. You cannot go ahead and carry from one to the other. We'll say the logic would seem to be is when they're tied together, they're mamish next to each other, so you could carry from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah without an intervening Carmelis. If they're not tied to each other, even though they are next to each other, bepashtos, when you carry it from one to the other, there will be an intervening Carmelis. Let's just go a little bit weiter. So we'll say this is really fascinating. We'll stop with this sugya. Itmar Sina. Rafuna Amar Motzin Hemeno Mimeno Ziz Kolshu Umemale. Rav Chista Rabba Rafuna Amri Osem Makom Arbaam Mala. Both listen to this fascinating case. You're in a boat. We'll say let's assume that your boat is docked or is anchored in a freshwater lake. Halavai Ushabi Zocha. Right, so we'll say, my boat is anchored on a freshwater lake. So now what's the issue? It's Shabbos, spending Shabbos on the boat. Right, so what happens now? I want water. I want drinking water. So the shaila is, how do I get the water from the lake into my boat? Right, the lake is a Carmelis. My boat is a Rishus Hayachid. Now granted, I know it's not an Issa D'Oraisa, but it's still an Issa D'Rabbanan. So what do I do in that case? So we'll say this is fascinating. So it's machlokes. Rav Huna says, all you need to do is what? Motzi ziz. You just you extend a rod. And that rod allows you to go ahead and draw water from the lake into your boat. Now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Motzi ziz kolshu midofni asvina al hamayim leheker ba'alma kidma farish le'el. So what says we're going to see. Remember again, because we're not dealing with the Orais, we're only dealing with the Rabbanons. Therefore, Rav Huna says all you need to do is extend a pole. Well, so you know what it's like? It's like a lechi or a kora. We're going to learn this by Mavui. You just extend the pole. That pole is a symbolic reminder. We'll see a reminder of what? We'll see in a little bit. And you could draw water like that. Rav Chista says this is incredible. Rav Chista, Rav Huna says, Osem makom arba or makom arba or memale. So what Rav Chista says, Rav Chista and Rav Huna say, you have to make like a box. That's 4 tfachim. Extend that box over the water and draw the water through the box. So essentially what you're doing is you're kind of creating like a little bit of a Rosh Hayachid, and you'll draw the water up through the Rosh Hayachid. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Makom arba, chalol dalid, mukaf mechitzos ketanos, umechitza tluya materes amayim. So we'll say essentially, halachically, what we do is you create suspended partitions. So create a box that has suspended partitions. We will view the partitions as if they extend downward, and you draw up the water through your Rosh Hayachid, through your created Rosh Hayachid. Pretty incredible. So let's analyze just a few more lines. Rav Huna Amar Motzi Emen Aziz Kol Shu Mamale Kasavar Karmelis Me'ara Mashchinon Va'avira Makom P'torhu. So what is Rav Huna's logic? Rav Huna says like this. He says the lake, the water is a Karmelis. Really, the area of the Karmelis River is only on the bed, on the seabed of the lake, which means any area above that is the airspace of the lake, and the airspace of a Karmelis is a Makom P'tur. So in reality, in exempted areas, you should be able to draw water without anything. You're allowed to draw water from the lake, because I will say at this point in time, we're assuming that Lamaisa what? You're already out of 10 tefachim of height. We're assuming again that the seabed is below 10 tefachim. Therefore, you're already in a makom p'tur, in an exempted area. So you should be able to draw the water from the lake without anything. So the Gemara says, however, ubedinu deziz nami lo yeva. You don't even need the rod. You don't even need like a protrusion. Elo ki heichi de lehavi lehakera. Rather, we just tell you to use the rod, so that there should just be a recognition. Because we'll say, what are we concerned about? See, the lake looks a lot like a Rosh Hashanah. It looks like a Rosh Hashanah. So because it looks like a Rosh Hashanah, we're nervous that if we allow you to draw water from the lake without any type of recognizable distinction, you may come to Chas Shalom, end up transferring an item from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, what do we say? Stick out a rod, a fishing pole. Stick out a rod. This is just a recognizable distinction that the lake is a Karmelis. You're really drawing from a Makom P'tor, an exempted area, and therefore again, but the rod is to remind you that this case is different. Osem Makom Arba Malik Kasarve Karmelis Misvas Mai Mashkinon. They will say they hold that actually the airspace of a Karmelis is measured from where? The surface of the water. See, here's the fundamental machlokas. The first opinion holds that the airspace of a Karmelis is measured from the seabed, in which case when you're on your yacht drawing water from the lake, in reality you're drawing water from a makom p'tur, an exempted area. And the only reason you need the rod is to remind you that this is a Karmelis and not a Rosh Hashanah. The second opinion, right, ultimately again, Rav Chisda says that halacha l'maisa, Rav Chisda, Rabbi Avua say that really the airspace of the Karmelis is measured from the surface of the water. Karmelis is my mashkina. Maya ara semichta. The water is considered to be, I will say, the entire is like considered to be like one thick land mass. Ilo avid makom arba kametaltel me Karmelis Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you don't make your box of daled amis, which suspended mechitzas, it's as if you are carrying from a Karmelis ultimately again to Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say, so bottom line, the machlokes is as follows. Really, everyone's agreeing like this. The lake is a Karmelis. I want to draw water from the lake into my boat. My boat is Rosh Hashanah. How do I do it? First opinion says, really, you don't need anything. You could do it. Why? Because the first opinion says that the land of the Karmelis is the seabed. By the time you get to the top of the lake, you're already like Mokum there. Because we'll say Karmelis, like Rosh Hashanah, only extends up to 10 tefachim. By the time you get to the top of the water, you're already into Makom P'tur, which means that technically speaking, you could just draw water. But because we don't want you to confuse this with another Shrabim, we tell you extend the pole. The pole is just a simple reminder. Second opinion says, no, the airspace of the Karmelis is measured from where? The surface of the water. So really, if you were to take water from the surface into your boat, you're transferring an item from a Karmelis to a Shechah, which is Asur D'Rabbanan. So what do? Make a box with walls, a hollowed out box, really, right? Box with no middle. Meaning make a receptacle with walls that's daled al daled, right? Hold that over the water. It's considered as if the mechitzas, the walls, extend all the way down. Draw water through the middle of that box. And in essence, what you've done is you've created your own Rosh Hayachid within the middle of the Karmelis. And that's how you draw water ultimately again into your boat. All right, boss, we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with this machlokes still more tomorrow.